There is a moment in human connection so quiet that it almost goes unnoticed, yet it carries more weight than grand declarations or carefully rehearsed gestures. It is not a performance nor a strategy. It is something far more fragile and far more powerful. It begins when one person stops trying to be understood and instead chooses to understand, not in the mechanical sense of listening for answers, but in the deeper psychological sense of presence, the kind of presence that does not interrupt to correct, does not rush to fill silence, does not turn another person's story into a reflection of its own. It simply stays, fully, without defense, without agenda. There is something in human beings that has been waiting their entire life for that kind of attention. And not admiration, not evaluation, but recognition, the feeling of being seen without being consumed. When a man experiences this not as exception, but as consistency, something subtle begins to shift. Not in the surface of his behavior, but in the architecture of his inner world. The parts of him that are always braced, always performing competence, always anticipating judgment, begin to loosen. And in that loosening, something rare emerges, safety, and safety, emotionally speaking, is not boring. It is revolutionary because most people confuse intensity with intimacy. They think love grows and sparks in tension, in uncertainty. But deep attachment is often born in the opposite direction, in the quiet erosion of fear, in the moments where someone is allowed to exist without needing to justify their existence. Imagine a man speaking about something he rarely speaks of, an old disappointment, a private failure, a dream he never pursued out of fear of not being enough. And instead of advice, instead of correction, instead of being redirected toward positivity, he receives something far more disarming. Stillness, attention, a gaze that does not flinch. In that moment, something ancient happens, not romantic strategy, not psychological trickery, but a return to something fundamentally human, the need to be witnessed without distortion. We often underestimate how lonely people are, not because they are unloved, but because they are unseen in the ways that matter most. They are acknowledged in roles, provider, partner, friend, but rarely encountered in essence. And when someone finally meets that essence without trying to reshape it, the emotional system registers it as significance. Not attraction in the superficial sense, but resonance. A kind of internal recognition that says, "Here, I do not have to fragment myself." And this is where emotional depth begins, not in pursuit, but in permission. There is also another layer, quieter still. It is the subtle act of allowing a man to be unfinished in your presence, not as a project, not as something to fix or optimize, but as a human being still in motion, still becoming, still carrying contradictions he does not fully understand himself. We live in a world that constantly pressures people to present themselves as resolved, certain, defined, but love, real love, has always had a strange relationship with incompleteness. It does not require perfection, it requires honesty, and honesty is often most visible in the places where control breaks down. When someone can sit beside that unfinishedness without fear, without withdrawal, without the silent pressure of expectation, something profound begins to grow. Trust, not the transactional kind, but the existential kind, the kind that says, "I am safe even when I am not impressive." And from trust, affection stops being performative. It becomes organic. It no longer needs to be maintained through effort. It begins to return on its own like breath. There is a paradox here that psychology quietly confirms, but philosophy has always known. We are not drawn to those who complete us, but to those with whom we can stop defending ourselves. And yet the most subtle act remains almost invisible. It is not what is done, but what is withheld. The withholding of judgment, the withholding of interruption, the withholding of the impulse to define another person too quickly, because to define someone too quickly is to reduce them, and reduction is the enemy of intimacy. Real emotional connection expands rather than captures. It leaves space for contradiction, for change, for the strange unfolding of personality over time. It does not say, "I know who you are." It says, "I am still learning you." And in that sentence, there is humility. And humility is one of the rarest forms of emotional generosity. Over time, something almost imperceptible happens in such a dynamic. The man begins to associate your presence not with performance, but with relief. And relief, when it becomes consistent, transforms into attachment, not because it is demanded, but because it is trusted. He does not fall in love because he is convinced. He falls because he is no longer bracing, because somewhere in his nervous system he stops preparing for emotional withdrawal. He stops anticipating the need to defend himself. He stops rehearsing who he must be in order to remain accepted. And in that absence of defense, connection becomes effortless. But perhaps the deepest truth is this: the subtle act is not something you do to someone else. It is something you become within yourself. The capacity to remain open without calculation. The willingness to be present without control. The courage to let another person exist without turning them into a narrative you can manage. That is what changes everything. Because love, in its most enduring form, is not triggered by intensity. It is revealed through safety, sustained attention, and the quiet dignity of acceptance. And when someone finally encounters that without condition, without demand, without the need to perform for it, they do not simply feel desire. They feel home, and home, once found in another human being, is not easily forgotten. It becomes a quiet reference point in the mind, a place the heart keeps returning to, even in absence, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. And in the end, that is what most people have been searching for all along. Not someone to complete the story, but someone with whom the story no longer feels like it must be defended. Just lived. To be truly seen without distortion is one of the rarest psychological experiences a human being can have, and yet it is also one of the most quietly transformative. Most people move through life not as they are, but as they are interpreted, filtered through expectations, projections, assumptions, and the unconscious need others have to make them fit into something recognizable. In that process, a person slowly becomes less of a living, evolving consciousness and more of a role, a function, a summary that feels stable enough for others to handle. But the inner world does not survive reduction without cost. Something in us resists being flattened. We begin to feel unseen even when we are constantly looked at. Heard but not understood, acknowledged but not recognized, and this creates a subtle form of emotional loneliness that has nothing to do with physical presence. It is the loneliness of being translated incorrectly again and again, until you start wondering whether anyone is actually meeting you at all, or only meeting their idea of you. To be seen without distortion is not simply someone observing you closely. It is someone suspending the impulse to interpret you too quickly. It is the willingness to let ambiguity exist without rushing to resolve it. Because most people, in their need for psychological efficiency, complete others prematurely. They hear a fragment of a story and build an entire identity around it. They notice a trait and turn it into a label. They witness a moment and assume it is the whole. But true perception requires restraint. It requires the discipline of not filling in the blanks with assumptions. And this restraint is deeply intimate because it creates space where a person can unfold rather than be categorized. In that space, something remarkable begins to happen. The individual is no longer performing coherence for survival. They are allowed to be inconsistent, layered, even contradictory without fear of losing relational security. Psychologically, this experience touches something foundational, the need for existential validation. Not validation of achievements or traits, but validation of being itself. The feeling that one's internal world is not too complex to be held, not too nuanced to be received, not too unfinished to be accepted in its current form. When someone meets us in that space without forcing simplification, the nervous system begins to relax in a way that feels almost unfamiliar, because so much of daily interaction is built on subtle correction, being adjusted, refined, interpreted, improved. But here there is no correction, only presence, and presence without distortion has a unique emotional signature. It does not feel like intensity. It feels like clarity, like the strange relief of no longer needing to explain yourself in advance. You can speak without editing every sentence for acceptability. You can pause without fearing misunderstanding. You can exist without translating yourself into something more digestible. This kind of seeing does not demand perfection. It dissolves the need for performance. And in that dissolution, a deeper form of authenticity emerges. Not the curated authenticity of self-expression, but the unguarded authenticity of simply being as one is, without the constant negotiation of how one is being received. And perhaps that is why it leaves such a lasting imprint, because to be seen correctly is not just to be understood. It is to be released, even if only briefly, from the burden of being misinterpreted by the world. When safety becomes the deepest form of attraction, something in the usual logic of desire begins to dissolve. People often assume attraction is built from tension, from uncertainty, from the electricity of not knowing where they stand. But beneath that surface interpretation lies a quieter truth about the human nervous system. What we chase intensely is not always what we attach to deeply. Intensity may capture attention, but safety captures the inner world. Safety is not the absence of emotion, it is the absence of threat within emotion. It is the experience of being able to express yourself without anticipating emotional consequences that feel unpredictable or punishing. And when a man encounters this consistently, something in him that has been conditioned to stay alert begins to soften. Not because he is persuaded, but because he is no longer bracing. Most people underestimate how much of adult personality is shaped by subtle forms of emotional vigilance. The habit of monitoring tone, adjusting expression, preparing for misunderstanding, or carrying the invisible weight of how one might be perceived. Over time, this vigilance becomes so automatic that it feels like personality itself. But it is not personality. It is adaptation. And then, suddenly, there is a presence where adaptation is no longer required. In such a presence, there is no need to manage impression, no need to carefully construct emotional outcomes, no need to anticipate withdrawal or sudden shifts in warmth. The relational environment feels consistent, not because it is predictable in a dull sense, but because it is emotionally reliable. And reliability, in human connection, is often more transformative than intensity. This is where attraction begins to change its form. It is no longer driven by the urgency of uncertainty, but by the relief of emotional steadiness. The body begins to associate a person not with activation of anxiety, but with the easing of it. And the nervous system is honest in a way the mind often is not. It remembers what allows it to relax. When a man feels safe in someone's presence, he begins to reveal parts of himself that do not survive in environments of evaluation. Not because he is instructed to open up, but because he no longer feels the need to withhold. He speaks differently. He pauses differently. Even his silence changes texture. It is no longer defensive. It becomes expressive. And in that shift, intimacy deepens without effort. There is no strategy involved, no calculated progression of closeness. Instead, there is a gradual removal of internal barriers that were never consciously chosen in the first place. Barriers built from past misunderstandings, past judgments, past experiences where openness did not lead to safety. What makes this so powerful is that safety does not demand transformation. It allows revelation, and revelation is far more intimate than improvement, because improvement implies judgment, while revelation implies acceptance. Over time, this creates a strange reversal in emotional hierarchy. The person who provides safety becomes associated not with dependency, but with clarity, not with neediness, but with emotional coherence. Being around them feels like returning to a version of oneself that is less fragmented, less guarded, more whole, and yet this form of attraction is not loud. It does not announce itself dramatically. It accumulates quietly, through repeated experiences of being emotionally unharmed in moments where harm was anticipated. It grows in the spaces where defensiveness was expected but never required. That is why it becomes so enduring. Because the mind may forget words, it may reinterpret events, it may even distort memories over time, but the nervous system rarely forgets safety that felt genuine. It becomes a reference point, a baseline against which other emotional experiences are unconsciously measured. And once someone becomes that reference point, they are no longer just a person in memory. They become a felt sense of emotional home. To witness another human being as unfinished is to resist one of the strongest impulses of the mind, the desire to categorize, to complete, to stabilize identity into something manageable. We are constantly pressured to define people quickly, to decide what they are, what they mean, how they behave, and what role they occupy in our internal narrative. This is how the mind creates order. But intimacy does not grow in order. It grows in openness, in the willingness to allow a person to remain in motion without forcing them into a fixed shape. When someone is seen as unfinished, they are no longer treated as a conclusion. They are treated as a process. And this subtle shift changes everything about the emotional climate between two people, because being seen as finished can feel strangely suffocating, even when it is positive. It implies limitation. It suggests that growth has been accounted for, that complexity has been mapped, that there is nothing left to discover that might contradict the established idea. But human beings are not static structures. They are unfolding contradictions, evolving histories, shifting emotional landscapes that rarely remain consistent for long. To love someone as though they are already complete is, in a quiet way, to stop being curious about them. And when curiosity disappears, emotional stagnation begins to take root. There is something deeply relieving, therefore, in being around someone who does not rush to define you, who does not take one version of you and elevate it into your entire identity, who can hold your strength without assuming you are always strong, and hold your uncertainty without assuming you are always lost. This kind of perception creates space for multiplicity, for the possibility that you are not one thing, but many things existing at once, sometimes even in contradiction. In psychological terms, this allows for what can be described as relational breathing room, the sense that you are not trapped inside an expectation of consistency, that you are allowed to change your mind, your mood, your direction, without fear of losing your place in someone's perception of you. And this freedom is quietly transformative, because it removes one of the most exhausting burdens in human relationships, the need to remain psychologically legible at all times. When a man experiences this kind of acceptance, something subtle begins to shift in his internal world. The parts of him that are always performing stability begin to relax. He no longer feels compelled to present a finalized version of himself. He can speak from contradiction. He can express uncertainty without fearing that it will become his defining trait. He can exist in transition without being treated as incomplete in a dismissive sense. And paradoxically, it is in this state of being unfinished that he becomes more emotionally present. Because he is no longer spending energy maintaining a fixed image, that energy returns to authenticity, to spontaneity, to a more honest engagement with the moment. He is not trying to be understood in a permanent way. He is simply allowing himself to be experienced as he is, as he becomes. This also creates a different kind of trust. Not the trust that someone will remain the same, but the trust that someone will not punish you for changing. And this is a far deeper form of relational security than consistency alone. It acknowledges that growth often involves uncertainty, and that emotional evolution requires permission, not surveillance. To witness someone as unfinished is, in essence, an act of humility. It is the recognition that no single moment contains the entirety of a person. That identity cannot be captured in a single interaction, a single emotion, or a single behavior. And when this humility is present, something rare emerges between two people, the feeling that they are not being known too quickly, and therefore not being reduced too easily. In that space, connection becomes less about conclusion and more about continuation. Emotional relief is one of the most underestimated forces in human attachment, precisely because it does not announce itself as attraction. It does not arrive with intensity or spectacle. It arrives quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the moments where the body realizes it does not need to prepare for emotional strain. And yet, this quiet relief has a profound psychological consequence. It reshapes what the heart begins to associate with safety, presence, and connection. Human beings are not only drawn to pleasure, they are also shaped by the cessation of tension. Much of what we call desire is entangled with anticipation, with uncertainty, with the subtle activation of emotional alertness. But relief operates differently. It does not heighten the nervous system, it settles it. It does not create urgency, it creates ease. And ease, when consistently experienced in the presence of another person, becomes quietly binding. When a man stops feeling that he must constantly defend, explain, or calibrate himself in someone's presence, something internal begins to loosen, not in a dramatic way, but in a physiological one. The body no longer anticipates correction in every exchange. The mind no longer rehearses responses in advance. Even silence becomes safe rather than ambiguous. And this shift is not intellectual, it is embodied. Over time, the nervous system begins to encode that presence as a place of release. And release is powerful because it contrasts sharply with the rest of life, where most interactions require some degree of emotional management. Work requires performance, social environments require adaptation. Even relationships, in many cases, require negotiation of expectations. Against this background of constant adjustment, a space where adjustment is unnecessary feels profoundly rare. This is where attachment begins to form in a way that is not driven by pursuit, but by return. The mind does not chase relief in the same way it chases excitement. Instead, it gravitates toward it. It begins to associate a particular presence with the experience of internal quiet. And once that association is formed, proximity itself starts to carry emotional significance. What makes this dynamic so subtle is that it does not rely on dramatic moments. It is built in ordinary interactions. A conversation where misunderstanding is not escalated but softened, a pause that is not filled with pressure, a difference that is not turned into distance. Each of these moments sends a signal to the nervous system that says, "You are not in danger here. You do not need to brace." And over time, these signals accumulate. They create a pattern that feels less like an event and more like a state. The presence of a person becomes synonymous with the absence of emotional threat, and in psychological terms, that association is deeply formative. Relief also has another layer. It restores access to parts of the self that are usually hidden under vigilance. When someone is no longer managing how they are perceived every second, they begin to express more freely, not because they are trying to be vulnerable, but because they no longer feel the need to filter themselves so heavily. This creates a sense of emotional spaciousness, where identity feels less compressed and more natural. And in that spaciousness, connection deepens without effort. There is no need for dramatic gestures or constant reassurance. The bond forms through reduction rather than addition. Less fear, less tension, less internal noise. What remains is presence, unforced and undistorted. This is why emotional relief can quietly evolve into attachment. Because the human system does not only remember who excites it, it remembers even more deeply who allows it to exhale. And in a world where so much interaction requires holding one's breath in subtle ways, the person who becomes associated with release begins to occupy a place that is difficult to replace. The quiet intelligence of withholding judgment is not about emotional distance. It is about emotional restraint in the most conscious sense. It is the ability to notice the human impulse to categorize, to evaluate, to define, and to deliberately pause before acting on it. In most interactions, judgment happens so quickly that it feels like perception itself. A tone is interpreted as arrogance. A silence is interpreted as disinterest. A contradiction is interpreted as inconsistency. And in that instant, a person is no longer encountered as they are, but as they have been labeled to be. Withholding judgment interrupts this automatic closure. It keeps the encounter open a little longer than the mind prefers. And in that extra moment of openness, something essential can be revealed that would otherwise be lost to premature certainty. It is not indecision. It is precision slowed down enough to remain accurate. Human beings often underestimate how quickly they are reduced in the minds of others. Not out of malice, but out of cognitive efficiency. The mind seeks patterns, shortcuts, familiar categories. It wants to stabilize the uncertainty of another person into something it can navigate. But intimacy resists this stabilization. Because intimacy requires continued discovery, not final assessment. When judgment is withheld, space appears. Space for contradiction, space for emotional change, space for expressions that do not immediately align with expectation. And in that space, a person feels something rare. They are not being finalized. They are not being sealed into an identity that cannot evolve. They are instead being allowed to remain fluid. This has a profound psychological effect, because much of human anxiety in relationships comes from the fear of misinterpretation. The fear that one moment will be taken as the whole story. The fear that complexity will be simplified into something inaccurate but permanent. When judgment is suspended, even temporarily, that fear begins to soften. Not because the person is being idealized, but because they are not being concluded. Withholding judgment also changes the rhythm of listening. It turns listening into reception rather than interpretation. Instead of listening in order to respond, or listening in order to classify, there is listening simply to receive what is being expressed in its current form. And this kind of attention has a quality that is immediately felt, even if it is not consciously recognized. It feels slower, wider, less invasive. In such an environment, a man does not feel the need to defend every inconsistency or clarify every ambiguity. He can allow himself to be seen in fragments without rushing to assemble those fragments into a defensible whole. He can speak without the pressure of immediate coherence, and in that permission, something important begins to unfold, authenticity without self-correction. This does not mean there is no discernment. Withholding judgment is not the absence of understanding, it is the delay of conclusion. It is the recognition that understanding deepens when it is not forced into early definition. And over time, this patience creates a kind of emotional safety that is not loud, but deeply stabilizing. People often think they are seeking those who agree with them, or those who mirror them, or those who validate their existing identity. But at a deeper level, what many are actually seeking is someone who can hold their complexity without rushing to simplify it. Someone who can stay present in the presence of ambiguity without needing to resolve it prematurely. And in that presence, something subtle yet powerful happens. the relationship becomes less about being judged and more about being understood in motion. Less about being categorized and more about being witnessed as an unfolding process. That is where real depth begins to form, not in the certainty of conclusions, but in the discipline of remaining open long enough for truth to fully reveal itself. To experience love as a returned emotional home rather than performance is to recognize a shift that happens not in the external relationship, but in the internal landscape of identity. Most people, without realizing it, enter relationships as a form of subtle performance. Not deception in the obvious sense, but adaptation, shaping tone, behavior, expression, even silence, in ways that preserve acceptance. Over time, this creates a split between who a person is and who they feel they must be in order to remain emotionally secure. But there are rare dynamics where this split begins to dissolve, where presence does not require performance, where being does not require justification, and in that space, something deeply human begins to surface, the feeling of returning to oneself rather than assembling oneself. Home, in this emotional sense, is not a place of perfection or resolution. It is a place where vigilance is no longer necessary, where the nervous system does not have to monitor every interaction for subtle signs of withdrawal, disapproval, or emotional unpredictability. It is the absence of internal monitoring, and that absence feels like relief so profound it is often mistaken for love itself at first. But what is actually happening is simpler and deeper. The self is no longer fragmented by expectation. In many relationships, people unconsciously live in a state of emotional fragmentation. One part of them is expressing, another part is observing how that expression is being received, and yet another part is preparing for possible rejection. This internal division creates exhaustion, not always visible, but constantly felt, and over time, it makes connection feel like effort, even when affection is present. When someone becomes a source of emotional home, this fragmentation begins to settle, not because the relationship is perfect, but because the internal need for constant self-monitoring diminishes. There is no longer a need to edit oneself in real time, no need to anticipate emotional consequences with every word. The presence of the other person does not trigger correction, it allows continuity, and continuity is what the psyche interprets as safety. This is why such connections feel different from excitement-based attraction. Excitement is often marked by unpredictability, by emotional spikes, by the tension of not knowing what comes next. But home is marked by recognizability, a sense that even in change, there is something stable in the way one is received. To be emotionally at home with someone is not to be fully known in a fixed sense. It is to be consistently allowed to exist without distortion. To feel that your presence does not require translation or defense, that you can move through different versions of yourself without losing relational grounding. And in that experience, identity begins to soften in a healthy way. The need to perform coherence fades. The need to present a polished or controlled version of self becomes less urgent. Instead, there is space for ordinariness, for inconsistency, for the natural fluctuations of being human. What makes this so powerful is that it is not dramatic. It does not rely on intensity or constant affirmation. It relies on something quieter, acceptance that does not fluctuate with emotional weather, and that consistency becomes the emotional architecture of what the mind begins to interpret as home. Over time, the person associated with this feeling becomes more than a partner or companion. They become a reference point for internal ease, a place where the self feels less defended, less divided, more integrated. And in that integration, love stops feeling like something you perform to maintain connection. It starts feeling like something you inhabit, naturally, as yourself.